My name is Rosalie. My background is a medical doctor, but I've been very frustrated at how limited our medical approach has been to Aboriginal health. And that's led me to do this PhD. And I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where each of us are, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. So I began my research with an interest in climate change and Aboriginal people, but very quickly I realised that kind of looking at climate change, I was looking at it from a very non-Aboriginal perspective, and looking at it from a decolonising perspective, the way Aboriginal people see the world, really made me see that climate change was just part of this great colonisation project that was already undermining what Aboriginal people were needing. And by transforming that perspective and sharing Aboriginal knowledge in various ways, I think there's such an opportunity to enhance primary care and use that as a means towards sustainable development. So the research is with a project called the Interplay Project, and you'll see down the bottom there the Interplay team. And I have to acknowledge that it was funded through the Cooperative Research Centre for Remote Economic Participation.
Rosalie, at the moment I have to say all we can say is a black screen with Rosalie Schultz has started screen sharing on it.
Ah, that's not very good, is it?
No, I thought it was just me.
Aha.
So you're back.
What about now?
You're still here.
Ah, ha. So it worked for a moment, but not now.
Well, it didn't really work.
Oh, okay.
They got blank screen.
Share, that's what I want to share.
That's
How's
it.
that?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, so that's my first slide. And so you can quickly read through the names of the people there and see some photos, but I'll just go on. So this is a structure of the presentation. I'm going to talk about planetary health, and then sustainable development goals, and then closing the gap goals, and kind of look at sustainable development goals and closing the gap goals side by side. Then look at Indigenous peoples globally and how they interact with sustainable development goals, and how that go on to how that interacts with health services.
Hi, Rosalie. Sorry, is it possible that we record the presentation? Is that okay?
Yeah, it is okay. I thought it was being recorded, because I got this message to say that it was.
Yeah, I think it is. If you look in the top left hand, there's a little red button with recording against it.
Okay, great.
So, so what Rodrigo should do is in a couple of days, early next week, he'll park it up on the website somewhere and put a link out.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Perfect. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. And then I'll end by kind of reimagining primary health care for Aboriginal people in Northern Australia. So I have to say that the Aboriginal people that we've been working with are people in remote communities, and well, I know Aboriginal people are all different, and I don't make any assumptions this applies to anybody, but it's sort of what I've learned from the remote Aboriginal people that we're talking to. So this is the planetary boundaries, which was a framework that developed by the Stockholm Resilience Centre to help us think about how human activity is affecting planet Earth and the limits that the planet places on how much we can continue to grow in our impact on the environment. And you see at the top there is climate change, and that is how increasing levels of greenhouse gases are acting like a blanket on the Earth. And that safe boundary, that inner green line, is 350 parts per million, and you'll see we're already way beyond there. We're into the yellow space, which is uncertain how safe it is. Then the next segment is novel entities, and the reason that's got a grey up there is it's probably not a global planetary boundary, it's probably a regional planetary boundary. And so although there's novel entities damaging the earth in regions, it's not clear how that is as a global scale. But from the perspective of primary healthcare, novel entities includes antibiotic resistant organisms, and we know that they're already threatening the ability of healthcare to be effective. Stratospheric ozone depletion is the next planetary boundary, and then below that, atmospheric aerosol loading. So that's another one where it's probably not a global phenomenon, but it's a regional phenomenon. And we know that in India, there's very high levels of ozone loading, and that's interfering with the Indian monsoon and the ability of Indian people to grow food. And so India is now really suffering from floods and drought intermittently through the aerosol loading, in addition to climate change. So the next boundary is ocean acidification, which is another effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, making the ocean unable to sustain the corals that need the right level of carbon dioxide. Then the next planetary boundary is we're way, way over the limit, probably more over the limit than any other boundary, and that's biochemical flows, which was previously called nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, but really that's how fertilizers have completely overwhelmed the ability of farmland to be productive, and also eutrophying the oceans through the runoff of fertilizers. So that's the boundary where we're most way over the limit of where we can survive safely. And I guess I'll just skip around. So land system change is another one that we're over the boundary. That's about forest cover, and even in Australia, we're destroying our forests very rapidly. And then the other boundary is genetic diversity, and so we hear that we're in this 6th extinction phase, and there's a dramatic loss of genetic diversity, and that's another boundary that we're way over the margin of. So moving into the human ecology, the United Nations Agenda 2030 developed these Sustainable Development Goals, which is really a global plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity to enable human beings to survive in a sustainable way. And it should interact quite well with the planetary boundaries concept. And there certainly is work where the people working on each are talking to each other. So you see there's 17 global goals for sustainable development and 169 targets. So it's a huge bureaucratic process for every country to try to show how it's meeting these targets. But it really recognises that every country should be having the same aspirations for sustainable development. Moving on from the Millennium Development Goals, which were really focused on developing countries, the global goals for sustainable development really recognise that every country should be having the same aim. So goal 3 is good health and wellbeing, and that's where primary healthcare fits in. But of course, social and ecological determinants of health mean that to have good health, we need to address all the other goals as well, particularly education, work, clean water and sanitation. And the overall premise of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. So in case you don't know, here's Australia's Global Sustainable Development Goal dashboard, and we're doing incredibly poorly. So goals in green mean we're doing well, and there's no goals in green. Last year we had some green goals in 3 health and 6 clean water, but this year we've gone downhill, and even those goals we're in the orange zone. And the red ones are where we're doing particularly poorly. When they were first announced in 2015, we were 18th in the world. We're now 37th in the world. So we've really, as a country, not taken this seriously. Australia's put it in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as if it's an international goal rather than something that we should ourselves be working on. Now, I'll just go through a few of them. Goal 2 is end hunger. And the reason we do poorly on this goal is because of the high rates of obesity. And so obesity is a form of malnutrition, And with over 25% of the population obese, we're in the red character. We also do very poorly in this goal because of our high levels of fertiliser input, meaning that our agriculture is unsustainable. There we are, green is goal 7, affordable clean energy. I'm sure there's no wondering why we do so poorly on that. But to be in the green zone, you need to have 20% renewable energy. We've got 8.4%. The best performing country is Iceland, which has got 78% renewable energy, but we're there in the red. We do poorly in goal 10, which is reducing inequality. And the reason we do poorly on that is because of the great inequality of income. We do poorly in 12, responsible consumption and production. We do especially poorly in e-waste. We produce over 10 kilograms per person per year of e-waste. And 13, obviously, we do poorly in that because we have high carbon emissions. To be in the red zone, you need more than 4 tonnes per person per year. Where are we? 16 tonnes of carbon per person per year. So we're way over the limit for a climate action. God. And 17 is the other one. Another one we do poorly in. We do poorly in this is about partnerships for the goals. You need to have 0.7% of GDP as in aid. We're down at 0.2% and declining. So really, Australia's performance in sustainable development is an international shame. And there we are, the Closing the Gap report. We're doing pretty poorly on this too. The only Closing the Gap target that we're near to meeting is the new one, which wasn't even there in the original project, but that was to have 95% of 5-year-olds in early childhood education, and we're on track to meet that with 91%. The other goals we're nowhere near, and part of the reason for this is that these goals were really not developed with good consultation with Aboriginal people. And if you look at the goals of Aboriginal people, they've often got nothing to do with these things. So Indigenous people globally have their own sets of goals, which are about preserving cultural heritage, non-discrimination, self-determination, access to land. No mention of any of these in the Australia's Closing the Gap goals. So there's really a mismatch between Indigenous development goals and these Closing the Gap targets. And there's been some argument you might have heard about a goal for Aboriginal imprisonment, and government is just not interested in any reduction in Aboriginal imprisonment. So where do Indigenous people, this is globally, fit in with the Sustainable Development Goals? They really are a historic opportunity for Indigenous people in the development agenda, because Indigenous peoples are agents of change. They know about livelihood practices that are sustainable. They have traditional knowledge that can really help with some of those goals. And more fundamentally, some people have this idea of a way of life that's not all about consumption and earning a lot and growth. And that's where by listening more to Indigenous peoples, I guess globally and in Australia, that might be an opportunity to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And the other side of the equation with Indigenous peoples and Sustainable Development Goals is that globally and in Australia, Indigenous peoples are the poorest of the poor in education, so low levels of formal education, poverty, hunger, and high levels of vulnerability to climate change. So there's kind of two lenses that you can look at as Indigenous peoples and the Sustainable Development Goals. One is the opportunities and the other is the vulnerability. But by bringing these together, we can look at the opportunities for Australia through listening to Aboriginal people about sustainability and how we might meet these Sustainable Development Goals. The National Aboriginal Health Strategy, all those years ago, said this: Aboriginal culture is the very antithesis of Western ideology. The accent on individual commitment, linear time, the switch in focus from spiritual to worldly, the emphasis on possession and the pricing of goods and services, the rape of the environment, and above all, the devaluing of relationships between people, both within families and within the whole community as a determinant of social well-being, are totally at variance with the fundamental belief system of Aboriginal people. So that's where Aboriginal people can talk to us about health as a sustainable development goal. But generally, there's been disappointment in the global health community who feel like, although health was so prominent in the Millennium Development Goals, in the Sustainable Development Goals, there's just only one Sustainable Development Goal that specifically focuses on health. And because health practitioners think what they think is really important, they would like to see more emphasis on health within the Sustainable Development Goals. So going on to what is health? The United Nations World Health Organization definition of health still stands: a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Then there was a publication last year where a group of Indigenous people proposed a new definition of health for Indigenous people, which is human equilibrium in nature, spirituality and adaptation. So this matches some more of the definitions of health within the Aboriginal Health Strategy, which include health to Aboriginal people is a matter of determining all aspects of their life, including control over their physical environment, of dignity, of community self-esteem and justice. It is not merely a matter of provision of doctors, medicine, hospitals, or the absence of disease. And the other definition of health within the Aboriginal Health Strategy is the one that is much more commonly reproduced, which is this one that says it's not just the physical well-being of an individual, but refers to the social, emotional and cultural well-being of the whole community, in which each individual is able to achieve their full potential as a human being, thereby bringing into the total well-being of the community.
To be empowered and to have our culture, and knowing your culture and being strong culture, it also helps people be healthy. It helps them live life well and be strong with what they do. Because if you've got a healthy culture, you've got a healthy body.
So with this Interplay project, we've got some amazing recordings of Aboriginal people. Oh dear, I don't want to be empowered. Go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So going on from this Aboriginal view of health, here's the white fella view of health, which is looking at the life expectancy gap in the Northern Territory between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And you see that great big bit on the right is disadvantage. And what this really tells us is that we can do what we like with smoking, obesity, alcohol, and unless we deal with disadvantage, we're really going to be very inefficient at trying to do anything about Aboriginal health. And the next biggest part beyond disadvantage is this unexplained sector, which they attribute to some things, such as lack of access to healthcare, lack of healthy food, and difficulty accessing new technologies. But really, the big message here is that we need to, unless the socioeconomic circumstances of Aboriginal people are addressed, we're not really going to close the gap. And that should be what primary healthcare is all about. Primary healthcare was defined in the Alma Ata Conference in 1978, which talked about health as a fundamental human right and a global social goal, and really needing actions in social and economic sectors in addition to the health sector. So primary healthcare really recognises what we saw in that previous graph about social disadvantage being the overwhelming cause of the life expectancy gap, rather than primary healthcare being merely about more services. But unfortunately, as we know, almost as soon as the Alma Ata conference was finished, we stopped really talking about comprehensive primary healthcare and started talking about selective primary healthcare, because it was much more efficient in bringing about changes in health. And I guess the latest iteration of that is the National Key Performance Indicators, which tell us all about how many Aboriginal people had their blood pressure measured and their sugar measured, and really forgetting what primary health care should be all about, which is the social determinants of health.
They've trained us up in how to use tools out there. We've trained them how to use our type of things like tracking and all that.
Yeah, just go look at country and looking after the elders' country, my country, helping other people.
Knowledge to knowledge. We call it ngabadi. Ngabadi. Yeah, that's both ways. Yeah, feel good actually. Yeah, you learn something new as you go. We work with the school as well, and it's like a role model thing, taking them out to like some favorite spots around these joints and showing them what we do. We're trying to encourage them to try and follow our little footsteps, like being a ranger and that. And you know, quite a few of them, they was interested. But it's good for yourself. It's not like you, because I don't like to sit around at the house and do nothing. I like to move around and do a bit of work. It's good for your health. I reckon it's quite fun too.
Oh,
They've trained us up.
sorry. Okay. So looking at the Sustainable Development Goals as an integrated development plan, and the Matu Rangers there talking about health, this is a global picture of intact wilderness. And you'll see that. So 70% of land and 87% of the ocean has been modified by human activities. But there's 4 remaining areas of large scale wilderness globally, which is the northern forest in Russia and Alaska, the Amazon forest in Brazil, the Sahara deserts, and the Great Deserts in Australia. And just looking at where those deserts in Australia are, and you'll see that that's actually where there's really strong Aboriginal ownership of the land. The dark green region of this map is both the region with fewer endangered species, and the area with the blue crosshatch is where Aboriginal people have ownership of the land. And this is a map showing Aboriginal ownership as firstly being completely obliterated, and then this amazing reclaiming of Aboriginal ownership since about the 70s. So even for me as a professional working with Aboriginal people, I was just unaware of how much Aboriginal land ownership is really being reclaimed. So prior to 1788, it was all Aboriginal owned, and then 1965, there was no Aboriginal ownership. But since then, we've seen this growing repossession of Australia. And this one, it just shows the different tenures of Aboriginal land. And you can see that, so the hashed areas are registered native title claims, which is actually a huge percentage of the country, and great delays in the courts for people to claim their lands. But even when there's a registered claim, people still have some rights. But it shows that overall, almost three quarters of Australia, Aboriginal people have some legal claim to. Matching very closely with the National Reserve System. So this map goes back to the global map of where there's wilderness. A lot of that land is now owned and managed by Aboriginal people, and most of the threatened species are held by Aboriginal people. So there's great opportunity for Aboriginal people to help with protecting the remaining Australian biodiversity through instituting how they want to care for the land. And they tell us when the land is healthy, the people are healthy. So in focus groups, that people talked about how caring for country directly contributes to their health through access to bush foods, kangaroo, turtle, goanna, bush yam, sugar bag. They improve people's nutrition and opportunities for a sustainable food supply. The Caring for Country programs recognise Aboriginal people's knowledge and expertise, and through commercial enterprises can contribute to poverty alleviation. So there's a whole heap of the Sustainable Development Goals that Australia can make progress on through letting Aboriginal people do what they want to do on the land. I guess there was that interesting comment by the Martu Ranger where he says, "Oh, I like getting out there and being active." And it's the lack of access to land, which is one of the factors that makes it difficult for people to be active.
When you work on country, you're also part of the Lauren culture. We have about 2-3 different groups of young men and older men working. It's like how we encourage our people and young fellas that's been very strong in their work, well, in cultural way, as in people will see how strong our country will live, you know. So they get a lot of the practice of their Lauren culture stuff, and that's how it started being strong.
We want to see more young kids out in the country, learning about our culture, our land, instead of being in town and caught up with all the bad things. When we're out in the country, we feel that the spirit and our elders that have gone, their spirit is with us as well and guiding us. And I want to see those young boys, girls that are mucking up to be a good person, a good leader and a role model. This is kind of, I guess, time to tell them it's hard, but it's good. You feel good.
So primary healthcare includes health promotion, and ultimately health promotion is about power. This includes power to decide what is considered primary healthcare. We talk about empowerment, but often we're not wanting to release some of that power. For healthcare providers to empower, that means that either the power differential must go the other way or power itself must expand. But I think there's this idea in primary healthcare that we can empower people without any change in the dynamic. And I think that's one of the barriers to primary healthcare, really reclaiming what it was meant to be, which is about all the socioeconomic determinants of health.
I'm proud because I'm Yolmo and I got a lot of families connection from Mirichatua right across Arnhem Land. Out of that, I'll take my identity and my knowledge. Wherever I go, I can still be a Yolmo and carry my culture and show to the world. Every Yolmo right across Arnhem Land, we work together. And how that works, because our songlines connect the stories and how our the history's been connected to the waterfall, the plain, the bush, even the wind coming in. Homeland, it's like family. Like when you go back, you have to go back and see your family and live with your family. Because homeland is where you belong. Because our foundation and identity is back at home. You can't leave homeland. If you leave homeland, you've lost.
For me and my family, I like to go out and live in the country instead of being in town. Too much drink, that's what taken all our people away from their country, you know. I've been drinking, but that's gone past nearly 15, 16 years now. I've learned my lesson. And I want to see younger people do the same. When I go back to well number 6, 7, and Kaitera and all them places, I feel really at home. Sometimes during the night you get that cold wind feeling come to you, and might be the spirit of your old people, ancestors come, and you get that nice cool feeling and you feel at home. Must be your Jamu grandfather come, must be Nana. Oh, you're right, make you feel at home. You got your right to stay in the place. You can sense that in the, when you go there, your family there with you. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So one of the other things that really came out in my research was the importance of Aboriginal languages and literacy. And literacy is strongly associated with empowerment and contributes both directly and indirectly to health and well-being, because literacy in Aboriginal languages is really a marker for people being strong in both worlds. And language is part of people's identity, which is another determinant of well-being. Languages also need to describe and communicate traditional ecological knowledge, which is what we need for caring for country. So when the language is lost, all the knowledge of the ecology is lost. That's why conserving Indigenous languages in Australia and globally is critical for sustaining biodiversity. Strengthening language through working towards literacy in Aboriginal languages can ensure that traditional ecological knowledge embedded in those languages can be sustained.
I sometimes find that really difficult when you're trying to work with your own people and it doesn't get through because the dialogue isn't clear. What the government needs and what Yolngu wants. You have to come here, sit with us, spend some time, learn from us before you make things for our benefits. It needs to come from us. Let us decide what to do. It would be really good. Let the people do and decide what to do. Employment for Yolngu would be find ways to give Yolngu freedom to run their own businesses. My name is Trevor Kurowiwi. My clan group is Galpo. And my skin group is Palang.
So well-being is a very useful goal for service because it doesn't make any cultural assumptions. Everybody decides what their own well-being is based on their own values, lifeways and aspirations. And this contrasts with other measures of the Closing the Gap report. So well-being is a much more culturally nuanced perspective. And very interestingly in that, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Survey, which is a regular survey of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, includes a question about well-being, which gets people to measure their own life satisfaction. And what that found is that despite what the rhetoric is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they showed high levels of life satisfaction, particularly people in remote areas who had a mean life satisfaction of 7.6, and those in non-remote areas had a mean life satisfaction of 7.2. So the national non-Indigenous equivalent survey had a life satisfaction of 7.6. So it shows that Aboriginal people in remote regions have the same level of well-being as the non-Aboriginal population, and it's that Aboriginal people not in remote areas that are suffering the lower levels of well-being. And it really shows that despite great differences between Aboriginal people in employment, education and health, which in remote areas are reported to be poor, they enjoy high levels of well-being. And diversity is a cornerstone for understanding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. People have different cultures, geographies, contact histories, environmental challenges, and so very diverse cultural realities. And the failure of the Closing the Gap targets to recognise the diversity of Aboriginal people is a core problem, besides the fact that they turn complex socio-cultural challenges into a small number of technical indicators. Then try to make these indicators more like non-Aboriginal people. Looking at it from an Aboriginal way to maybe overcome some of these challenges, the ranger programs really embody culture and promote wellbeing. And they work across all the government and community priorities for wellbeing. So ranger programs involve things like caring for country, controlling feral animals, managing fire and water, protecting ecosystems. They enable people to share cultural knowledge, and this empowers them because it puts the ownership of the knowledge back with the Aboriginal people. And they improve health through physical activity, access to bush foods, and getting away from grog. So if we think about ranger programs as a form of primary health care, they provide so many benefits both for the people and the land, and getting towards the Closing the Gap goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's achievements in environmental, health, employment, finance, education, and community. There's opportunities for commercial enterprises for carbon farming, where traditional land management practices actually store carbon in the land, art and craft, and environmental services and pastoralisms. Ranger programs are really a positive lifestyle option for Aboriginal people in remote regions, and recognising Aboriginal knowledge and what Aboriginal people want, which is educational for us all. Then what Dustin, the Martu Ranger there, he talked about two-way learning, which is where people are learning together, and a two toolbox approach where Aboriginal knowledge and skills complement the non-Aboriginal knowledge and skills in a kind of a community development way for Aboriginal people, employing Aboriginal people who are the holders and custodians of that knowledge. So my take-home messages are: Aboriginal health is the well-being of people, communities, and land. And caring for land is caring for people. Primary healthcare includes promoting intersectoral collaboration for health, including language and land. Appropriate indicators of health include empowerment, language, and access to land. And if you think about sustainable development as a global responsibility, that includes recognising the knowledge of Aboriginal people to assist Australia to meet our goals, while acknowledging Aboriginal authority and expertise and power. Thank you.
Great, Rosalie. Thank you very much.
And if that link is live, which it doesn't look like it is, but there's more amazing videos there if you want to have a look at some of them.
Okay. So that's fascinating, and I'm going to have to take a while to think that through. And in a moment, I might just share something with you. But does anyone have any comments or questions for Rosalie on that?
She's on mute.
If not, let me just find...
Oh, sorry. Could I just ask, it's Margaret here.
Yes.
Can I just ask, I mean, at least, well, one question, and then, because I suppose it was just near the beginning, I was intrigued about, you know, you sort of said Australia had lost some green. There used to be green at the beginning for the sustainable goals, and one of the green ones was clean water, and being in Broken Hill, water is such a big issue. So I was just intrigued what had happened between the green and becoming sort of red or orange, whatever colour it was, for number 6.
Might get back to that. I skipped over it. Oh, so it's about life below water. with goal 13?
The life below water, the clean water, number 6 on the sustainable goals.
I think, look, I'm sorry, I didn't actually record that in my notes. I can forward you the document if you like. Yeah, it's eye-opening, really.
All right, thanks. That'd be great.
Yeah, there's 169 goals. I didn't go through the whole lot.
Fair enough. Let's just see if that works, or this works for a moment.
Maybe I'll stop sharing.
Yes, that might work, please. So let's try that. And so I like this concept of well-being, and I like the interplay logo, which has sort of well-being in the middle, and then these things clustered around it, which kept popping up at the end of your video segments. And the idea that there are various things that contribute to well-being, and that physical and mental health is only one part of that, and that, well, it's underpinned from the ecological determinants perspective by the ecosystem processes. And so I think it's quite a powerful way of beginning to think about what we're talking about here, in terms of it's not just about health, it's about broadly more well-being. And at a meeting I was at a couple of months ago with Fran Baum and David Legg and a few people, they're actually beginning to think through the people's health movement about how do we redefine the World Health definition to bring in some ecological determinants and some of this more sort of primary healthcare, Indigenous wellbeing focus to that definition. So, I mean, it's going to be a major thing to do because WHO being WHO, but people are starting to talk about that.
I guess it's also worrying that people have been talking about that for quite a long time and it doesn't actually catch on. We still look in the newspaper, still Scott Morrison talking about we want growth. So although there's certainly a undercurrent that's recognising that economic growth, GDP is not everything, it doesn't seem to catch the ear of the decision makers.
Well, that's right. And there are several different analyses of different reasons for that. But I think the analysis I like is that we have been colonised ourselves by the neoliberal worldview. And so we really have to go through our own process of decolonisation and reasserting our own or a different worldview. And that is beginning to happen. And I think Richard Dennis's latest book, Dead Right, is implying that the right has actually managed to shoot itself in the foot, and people are no longer believing the neoliberal story. We just haven't been very effective in putting forward a different story. But there are lots of people who are trying. Murdoch is making sure we're not getting heard very well. So there are challenges. Does anyone else want to say anything?
Hi, it's Sally, Rosalie. So I didn't really say before, but I'm a public health person and I've worked with Mel. My practices have been around teaching public health rather than in a practical sense out in the field. But I've always listened when I've heard those stories about well-being that I've learned from Aboriginal people more than anywhere else. And I know we had effort in the Australian Bureau of Statistics to develop a national wellbeing indicator, which wasn't necessarily very strong around land and country and belonging. But do you know any other countries in the world where you've been able to see wellbeing linked to land as strongly as you sort of proposed?
It certainly seems to be in the Indigenous indicator recognition that one of the characteristics of Indigenous people is that connection to land. And I think that's why the stolen generations was so fundamentally destructive, because it took people off their land. But one of the strengths of Indigenous people is attachment to land. And so there's within the Indigenous part of the United Nations, there's a lot of work towards that. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be a feature for non-Indigenous peoples, that we can move around. And obviously that's not the case for all Indigenous peoples, but especially where there's been removal.
I agree.
It's interesting. I was listening to a story last night, or a sort of several bits of different stories. One of them was this idea that, in fact, while there is this sort of understanding that Indigenous people are tied to country in a way, it doesn't mean they also weren't highly mobile. And there are stories of people there's a dreaming track that runs from somewhere in Western Australia across to Byron Bay. And people would go up and down those dreaming tracks, and they would cross dreaming tracks. And and we know there are Western Australian ochre shells in southern Victoria. And they might have gone hand to hand to hand to hand to hand like stories did. But there are lots of stories of people actually doing these massive, if you think of the old European aristocracy, the Grand Tour, where you took off around Europe and Greece for a couple of years, young fellas would take off around country for a decade and come back with all this experience, having made these connections along the dreaming tracks all over the country.
And even more so, now they've got motor cars.
Yeah. Business from Kintore to Yalata in a week. The other interesting story
Sorry,
go Margaret.
Oh, there's just another thing that I realised I'd been thinking of and I'd forgotten. But when people talk about Indigenous people, and they're sort of whatever the issues might be, like health or whatever, and their connection to land, or just Indigenous people, do they just are talking about people, say, like the Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, or Native American Indians, or the First Nations in Canada, or do they also mean people sort of, say, on Pacific Islands who are living on their islands and it is their country? I mean, they might have been, under someone else before, but now, it is their country, and it's primarily because was in Samoa, say, and 96% of people there are Samoans. So is that counted as being, I suppose, Indigenous? I mean, yes, they are Indigenous, but it's not, in some ways the same as being Indigenous, in Australia or something, or even if you think, oh, the Indigenous people in Britain, or do you think, no, they don't count because, I don't know. I was just curious, just, maybe just think about that when people mention, what the definition is in sort of some of these things.
Yes, so obviously there's a body of literature about that, and it is contested. It's better not to define people, but allow them to describe and identify themselves. So in a place that's never been colonised, as you say, people are Indigenous, but often what defines Indigenous is the fact that the country has been colonised, and that creates a distinction. And you do think, oh, I wonder who the Indigenous people of Britain are, but there doesn't seem to be people identifying as Indigenous in Britain. They just aren't.
Unless you're Celtic.
Right. Yes, you're right there. Yes.
So it plays out in Europe, but not in the same way. I think this idea of recent, in recent century colonisation, it plays out differently. I mean, the Irish definitely felt colonised by the British for a long time, and they think they're Indigenous to the Irish And so the Welsh, the Scots, the Cornish, the Bretons in France, the Basques, there is a similar dynamic playing out.
Thanks.
The other interesting story that I think feeds into this well-being thing is that, I mean, I think it was that young fella from Mato who said, you know, living life well also captures that idea of this idea of well-being. And that. But the other story last night, somebody was telling me that there's a guy in the Yarra Valley whose name I didn't catch, who was saying that one of the things that happened when Europeans arrived here in 1788 and we brought the smallpox or chickenpox or measles with us, this guy's done some work looking at what has happened in other Indigenous places where things were better documented at what happened to Indigenous people, and the death rate was 80 to 85%. So we arrived within probably a few years in eastern states and then progressively going west, travelling, they reckon, at about, he's found some stories that suggest it travels about 10 kilometres a day. These diseases progress across the country, and several days to weeks later, masses of people would just die. And so working backwards at what people were estimating, say, in the 1820s, 1830s, the populations were, he suggests that there weren't just 1 or 2 million people in Australia before 1788. There were probably 6 to 8 million people. So the carrying capacity of Australia was about 8 million people. And that the other interesting thing there is that when the pastoralists started to move out, and they were discovering this beautiful country, but because there was nobody there, or very few people there, remnant populations there, they thought that was the natural state of the country. But in fact, it had been intensively farmed for 50,000 years and was highly cultivated in its own way. And so, again, part of the theft of country, we also stole all that input that had gone into making that such wonderful pasture land. Which isn't quite as relevant to your thing, but I guess it's that connection to country, and that part of that colonial dislocation, I guess the point I was making, was because we wiped out the people, and that was one of the things that broke the social system. Hello, Nina H.
Oh, hello. I hope it's okay that I called in.
It's totally okay.
Where are you, Nina?
Oh, I work at the Uni of Queensland in the School of Public Health, and I only recently joined PHAA, so I saw the ad for tonight's meeting and thought that sounded pretty exciting.
I think you might have the wrong time zone because we're nearly finished.
Oh no, okay.
But that's it's been recorded.
Yes, that's right. I'm in Brisbane. That's what's happened. It was the yes.
Yep.
Yes.
All right.
Eastern Australian summertime is a real bugbear.
Yes. Oh, why don't Queenslanders do daylight saving, huh?
But we believe it's been recorded and you can watch the recording.
Okay, sounds good.
I know, because Leah, who is an apology, usually phones in from Townsville, and we always have to have this conversation the day before about, because she's English, which way to move the clock.
Yes, yes. All right, so I'll go and find the recording once it's online.
Well,
that sounds like a good
you
option.
can hang out for the rest of the conversation if you want.
All right, why don't I? I'll see if I can pick up what you're talking about. Or aside from the title.
The other bit I liked, Rosalie, was the health promotion is ultimately about power. And what that fella says, it's the guy from Darwinko, the Gubble fellow, power, people need to decide what to do. So I think this, again, it comes back to our government structure, you know, who's getting to make the decisions. And you mentioned something about power as well, something about I didn't quite catch your meaning about whether we give up power, or I think you said we talk about giving up power, but we maintain the structure, so we really are maintaining our power. So I guess the question is, how do we change that dynamic?
Yes, I've been amazed at how much I've read and seeing how different, I guess, different disciplines have addressed these diverse issues. So there's a good social work literature on empowerment, and the social worker trying to empower the client, but either power expands or the social worker loses power. Otherwise, there's no empowerment.
So when you say power expands, what does that mean?
Well, if a person is to be empowered, either there's more net power or it goes from one person to the other.
Okay. So is there more net power, or is it actually there is a static volume of power and it has to be moved from somebody to somebody else?
I think there's a expandable power base, but I guess even if the powerful are empowering the less powered, there's still a relative change. So even if there's more power in total, there's still a relative increase.
So, okay, so I keep the power I've got, but somehow I give you some more for you.
That's what we'd like to see, isn't it?
Because people also talk about power over as in contradiction or into contrast to power with. And so if I'm giving you some power, I mean, I think I have to give up power to share power with you, but it's moving from a power over to a power with model.
I agree. Yeah. I think that from my understanding, I think it's more of the notion of, rather than giving up power, it's more or less accepting that there's certain, like, obviously power plays, but not trying to, if you're in a clinical setting, not trying to come across as too paternalistic and that approach that's very dismantling to Indigenous people. So it's more about acknowledging that Indigenous people have their own set of power, and it's just leveling it out to ensure that there's no one person having too much control over the situation. So it's like a two-way thing. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Go, Sally.
Hi. Yeah. I'm just thinking of these things that we talk about in the classroom at this point, which I'm not doing very well, I have to say, after a big dinner. But one of the lessons learned from teaching is the students who have felt disempowered by going through an empowerment program like family wellbeing, which is what Mel's brought down to Sydney where we were working, understood the dynamics of their disempowerment, and then were able to demonstrate in different ways that they did through the class and through the talking afterwards, that realization of their own empowerment through learning about the dynamics around them and their own internal dynamics that were creating a sense of powerlessness, they were then more able to work with other people to enhance their sense of power. So it's kind of that multiplication effect that maybe the idea of expanding is alluding to. And then often you do get that thing about you land on the concrete somewhere, which is what the resilience literature does. It talks about what's the point of being resilient when I'm still going to crash down on concrete. Then that was our lesson as teachers was, our students would go out and try things out in their workplace, but they'd hit the concrete, and that was the stories that they'd bring back. where they just realised the structures that were there. And obviously, I don't know too much about what happened next, but they were able to sort of describe them, which is really interesting. Yeah, and they were learning from each other doing that.
Yeah, so Mel's work has certainly shown a growing power, isn't it? That nobody's been disempowered by the amazing work that in empowerment that Melissa's done.
And we will do.
And you will continue to do. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what we would be saying as the Public Health Association then, and what a lot of, I guess, the reconciliation processes are all about, action planning is about, is how do we transfer that power to expand Indigenous people's power in this system? At a meta level. Yes, Suzanne?
Sorry, I was just about to say, in what system, sorry?
Well, in the Australian political system, I guess, is what I'm talking about. It's
but maybe beyond Australia, in the global system as well.
Yes, because I mean the People's Health Movement is all about working both at the local, national, and international level.
Yeah.
And then in terms of this conversation, then how does acknowledging Aboriginal people's knowledge and ways of knowing about country and land management help with that power transfer?
And I'm very much aware of the risk there, where we know most Aboriginal people live in cities, and they may feel increasingly dispossessed, or that's not me, that's not me. So we just need to take great care.
It's very difficult because, like, even I agree 100%. It's like it's also, you can't just umbrella Aboriginal people within themselves as well, because we are so complex and diverse. It's saying like one model of working may be appropriate for us up in the territory. However, that same model may not be appropriate to mob that have been dispossessed and marginalised, unfortunately, because of the dynamics of that. And I think that's something that I'd like to see as well in the future, is to have that kind of more of an awareness as well, that like it's about maintaining that integrity and that cultural continuity for the ones that still have it. And then for the ones that have had it taken away, it's about continuing and strengthening that approach to improve outcomes. So it's a bit, yeah.
And I think also when you talk about outcomes, that people themselves need to choose what outcomes they want, rather than government saying, oh yeah, we want this many people to finish year 12 and this many people to have jobs. People should be choosing their own outcomes.
Yes, definitely. I know in terms of empowerment, over in a remote community in Ramangini, I heard on the ABC radio, the news, that they've got a program there that where they've established their own kind of community-based produce. So they grow their own produce and they in turn sell that at the local store. And I think that's a really good example of community empowerment and resiliency and control as well, because we all know that access to services is so such a big thing in communities. So yeah, I think that's a really good approach as well.
But I think it's got to come from the community itself.
Yeah,
rather than someone driving in with, here's some seeds, come on, start growing your own food.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's that self-determination. Yeah, I agree.
So the other thing that Sally, Nina, Suzanne, and maybe Margaret, oh, no, you were in the last one, was this thing that this project, the Public Health Association, is doing about trying to come up with a position on relating to country or relating to land. And so tonight's discussion was part of this longer ongoing project around thinking through some of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And Suzanne, your statement there made me think that in terms of us non-Aboriginal mob, we're thinking, well, we don't want to appropriate country, but we can talk about caring for land. And again, most white fellas live in cities and don't have a connection to land, really. Although one of the things that comes out of the Frank Fenner Foundation's work on the biosensitive urban framework is that you actually can connect to land at the scale of your back garden or your local park. It's not the same as a connection to country, and it's not the same as, say, a farmer or somebody would have as connection to their land, but there's still a possibility for some connection to a locale. But then I'm wondering if, you know, somebody has lost the bit of their identity which relates to their mob and country. I mean, there is still a possibility perhaps of working with re-engaging people with some sort of mob and country, even if it becomes, you know, artificially where you just happen to be at the moment, or as far back as you can trace your genealogy. Because I was thinking of this recently in terms of trying to come up with a governance arrangement if we were going to set up an Aboriginal government, and how you would select representatives into that. Because in non-Aboriginal mainstream Australian government, I'm working in this space of how do you select representatives and make them really represent you, not the interests of corporations. And I was thinking in Aboriginal mob, just from what I know from Central Australia, is it would have to be based somehow in clan groups or families. But that did bring up the question of how do people who've lost that connection connect in? And I didn't have an answer other than, you know, it's an active problem that needs to be managed. But I think it would be the same. So hearing tonight's conversation made me think, well, maybe it's the same process could be used to help people who've lost that connection to rediscover it somehow.
Hey, Paul, it's Sally.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing down a gauntlet because when I used to go to Canberra with the National Sorry Day Committee, and the Northern Territory delegates were very keen to say that they weren't connected in their rights and entitlements in the Northern Territory anymore because of the disconnection and their inability to prove a connection with land councils and stuff like that. And hence they weren't able to be buried on country. So there's problems to be solved in that way, with even adopting a paradigm that might appear coherent. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not trying to speak for people. I just thought it was ironic when you made that point.
Okay.
But I agree that representation that has a more that is more resonant with where people feel connection might make people care more, generally speaking. I don't know. I'm thinking of your thing that you mentioned about, I live near the Cooks River in Bidjigal country here in Sydney, so I feel really strongly every time I go around that river about its well-being. And it makes me feel good being there. But we aren't we're doing local and regional community organisational groups that kind of assist children to build that narrative of belonging to places. So the schools around here had a movement for a brief period, I'm not sure how sustained it was, that was We Are the Cooks River People. And there was always events down on the river where the kids were involved. And there were local actions, small ones, that came from that. The Cooks River's quite an active group of people around its preservation and upkeep, generally speaking. But it was interesting how that made everyone feel so proud to be a Cooks River person in the little time I spent with people talking about it. So yeah, it talks about a hankering and a longing too, to have that connection. And I think it's probably those emotional connections that are going to get changed to start. I think that's what change theory is all about, isn't it, really? And those emotional changes happen in empowerment learning as well. So what are we going to do? We just want to put people through processes. I don't know, you can put brackets around all the different processes, but just to shift them from that. I'm looking at the word unmuted on my screen, like it's muted thinking that they've got that's not wide awake to what's going on around them. I don't know. That's what I try and do in the classroom. And I really believe strongly in the power of just keeping busy and trying to make a difference, because there's not much else when the structure is so the way it is. Because the government doesn't want to change. They've built change out of it. I mean, that's what's bothering me the most thing. It's content free. It's run by managers. And I have no idea how the country even runs. That's how I'm quite pessimistic in that respect.
Sorry, Sally, what did you say just earlier? I couldn't really quite grab what you were saying with when you went to a conference, you found that it was interesting. So what were you saying about just earlier?
Stolen generations. So way back in 20, around the apology, there were some delegations that went backwards and forwards, some from the Northern Territory, I'll remember the uncle's name, some women from, not Yulnu, but quite like somewhere in the middle, not Granite's country, but north of there. They felt they weren't able to be part of, they wanted to know what would happen when they died, basically.
That's interesting.
It was very poignant stuff, because I've got connections to Wildpree family out there, and there are some members of the stolen generation in that family.
Yeah.
And they were that my experience was that people had been included. So this woman was showing me a direct experience of not feeling claimed back. Yeah, it was hard.
Because I just came back from a funeral. I've been to a few funerals this year, but one for my partner's uncle. He was stolen into Garden Point, and my family are from Tiwi Islands, like as you can tell by my last name. And so he was stolen from Baralula way when he was a young boy, and when he had his funeral, he wanted to be buried on Tiwi, and there was a bit of like a conflict between because it's such a difficult thing, because even though you know where you were taken from, he wasn't accepted back in the community because he was taken, and therefore like his adopted family or the people that he grew up with accepted him, and they took him in, and hence why he's buried there at the moment. So it's like it's such a complex and dynamic, isn't it, with stolen generations? Like it's so it's very sensitive, and it's very complex in itself, definitely.
There's no one story, that's for sure.
That's
you did drop out while you were telling me that story then, but I caught the gist of it. And yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Because one of the drivers of this conversation originally was this idea about building the planetary health movement and wondering about if we can reconnect people back to land and the planet as a sort of a living entity, then would that actually help us turn things around at the bigger sort of political economy level? So that's one of the things we're sort of testing out here to see how that might work.
You know, there's some very exciting things happening in London. You aware of that?
No.
A group called Extinction Rebellion, who's really serious about the failure of government to take on climate change. They've brought the whole city to a halt, and they're going to stay there.
Okay.
Don't look in the Murdoch media, look in the Guardian.
Okay. And I think in Canberra, well, all over Australia for the last couple of weeks, there have been these school kids going on strike to protest the government's inaction on climate change. And then there's a big rally here in Canberra next Wednesday, where there's going to be people coming on school strike from all over Australia to come and sit in Parliament House and tell people that they need to take action. I think this is really good because we got to take this level of action. But shutting down London, that sounds pretty good too. Maybe
Totally.
we should.
The police are supporting well, obviously I only know what I read in the media, but the police are supporting the protesters, and people are getting annoyed because they can't go to work, and the protesters say, well, you know, what's the point of going to work? And they get out and join them.
Yeah. It gives me the idea of an action. We could blockade the stock exchanges.
I definitely think that young people are the future, and I think that the more social action that we do take, you know, hopefully there will be something out of it. So it's good to hear that. Yeah, definitely.
For surely. So it's coming up to 9:22, so we've been running, and we try and probably wind up about 9:30 so everyone can go off and go to bed and get ready for the morning and anything like that. So I'll just sort of make that sort of, we've got 8 minutes left, announcement.
Well, I put a link in the chat line.
Yep.
I don't know if you can see that at your side.
Yep.
If you haven't had a look, it's from the big conference that all the international Indigenous groups are attending in Perth this week around suicide prevention. So it's the pre-release of their communiques. It's a set of draft recommendations, and they really resonate because of the things that we talked about today. And just show how everything works backwards and forwards all of the time. So, yeah, if we fix this problem, I'm going to fix all of the problems at once, right?
That's the plan.
That's the plan. Okay. No, we're not, and it's not about we fixing. I totally get that's the wrong end of the hammer. But yeah, so have a look if you like, and share them around, because I think the intention of getting them re-released was to allow everyone to see them first.
Yeah, Summer May Finlay there, she's the co-convener of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Special Interest Group within the Public Health Association. She does quite a bit of work for, well, with Melissa Sweet.
Yeah.
She's pretty amazing.
Yeah. So all good things are blowing from the west right now.
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm going to hang up and bid you all farewell. Thank you so much for welcoming me unannounced, and I'll see. I'll maybe hear from you again.
Yeah, we're probably going to do the next one of these in February.
Yeah.
Because December gets a bit busy, and January everybody's like getting over Christmas, New Year. And the one in February I think we've invited Fiona Armstrong, who is the convener for the Climate and Health Alliance. And she's going to come and talk to us about their idea of a national strategy for climate, health and wellbeing, with a bit of a think about what PHAA might do to help support that at the level that PHA can do that sort of thing. But we'll definitely be continuing this Indigenous health, land, relationship, how does that help the planetary health theme during next year. And we'll probably have a segment on it at the Adelaide Public Health Conference in September. And we may or may not get to Darwin in February or March or whenever it is for the National Indigenous Health Conference. Although it's looking less and less likely that we're going to make it to that one, just because it's taking us a bit of time to internally work out how we're going to do this.
It's, you may just want to have a side meeting at the conference to get advice.
We'll do that too, but we might also have a plenary and take over a day.
Yeah, well, there's some pretty good lively themes there to pick up on.
That's right. So yes, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Rosalie, very much for your presentation. Lots of good stuff there to think through and to develop further. No worries. So we'll bid you all good night. And so, Nina, when you get round to looking at the presentation, some of this conversation will make more sense.
Yes, sorry to come in. I didn't fully understand the invitation, didn't realise it was such a small group, but I've actually really enjoyed listening to you. I have a lot to learn. I haven't worked on Indigenous health issues for that long, so this is all wonderful learning for me. So yeah, I actually feel it was a real bonus to come to this little meeting. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, well, thank you for coming. All right, well, I might go too. So good night. Thank you.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you, Rosalie, for your lecture.
Thank
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.